Picture this. You're standing in a forest 66 million years ago, and the ground beneath your feet is trembling. Not from footsteps of massive predators, not from the thunderous calls of long-necked giants reaching for treetops. The trembling comes from something else entirely, from creatures no bigger than your house cat, scurrying through the underbrush with a hunger that will reshape the entire planet. For 165 million years, dinosaurs ruled this world. They owned the skies, dominated the land, and filled every ecological niche you can imagine. But in a single day, in a moment that lasted no longer than a blink in geological time, that reign ended. And what came next wasn't silence. It wasn't emptiness. It was the most explosive evolutionary takeover in Earth's history. This is the story of the mammal revolution. The story of how tiny, furry survivors emerged from the ashes of extinction to become lions, elephants, whales, and eventually us. It's a story that begins not with triumph, but with the most catastrophic day our planet has ever known. Whether you're listening to this while falling asleep, during a long commute, or just letting your mind wander through deep time, you're about to witness one of evolution's greatest plot twists, a moment when the meek truly inherited the Earth, and life found a way to not just survive, but to explode into forms more diverse and magnificent than anything that came before. And here's what makes this story even more incredible. We have the evidence. We can trace this takeover through fossilized teeth and ancient DNA, through geological layers and chemical signatures left in rock. We can follow the breadcrumbs that lead from mouse-sized survivors to the age of mammals. We can actually watch, step by step, how our world was reborn. So let's go back to the moment when everything changed, back to a day that lasted forever and ended in an instant, back to the beginning of our story. The asteroid was roughly 6 miles wide. Picture Manhattan, then imagine it hurtling through space at 45,000 miles per hour, carrying the kinetic energy of billions of nuclear bombs. When it slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, it didn't just hit the Earth, it wounded it. The impact crater, hidden now beneath layers of sediment and time, stretched over 90 miles across. But the crater was just the beginning. Within minutes, a wall of superheated debris rocketed back into the atmosphere, raining molten glass across continents. Massive earthquakes rippled around the globe. Tsunamis taller than skyscrapers swept across shallow seas. And then came the darkness. The impact hurled so much pulverized rock and soot into the atmosphere that sunlight couldn't penetrate to the surface. For months, possibly years, the world existed in a twilight that made photosynthesis nearly impossible. Plants withered, ecosystems collapsed. The great food webs that had sustained life for millions of years simply unraveled. 3/4 of all species vanished. The giant predators that had terrorized the land for over 100 million years were gone. The flying reptiles that had ruled the skies disappeared. Even in the oceans, massive marine reptiles that had seemed invincible simply faded into extinction. But here's where the story gets interesting, because while the giants were dying, something else was happening in the shadows. Hidden in burrows and hollow trees, tucked into rock crevices and underground tunnels, small mammals were doing what they had always done: surviving. These weren't the mammals you might imagine. There were no horses galloping across plains, no elephants trumpeting in forests, no whales singing in the depths. These were creatures that looked more like shrews than anything else, tiny, insectivorous, nocturnal survivors with brains barely larger than walnuts. But they had something the dinosaurs didn't. They had already spent 160 million years learning how to be small, how to be adaptable, how to live in the margins. While dinosaurs had grown large and specialized, mammals had remained generalists. They could eat almost anything. They could live almost anywhere. And most importantly, they were warm-blooded. That last trait would prove crucial. When the world turned cold and dark, when the great reptilian metabolisms began to fail, mammals could maintain their body temperature. They could stay active when others grew sluggish. They could keep searching for food when others were forced into deadly dormancy. The mammals that survived the impact weren't impressive by modern standards. Most weighed less than a kilogram. They had simple teeth suited for eating insects, small vertebrates, and whatever plant matter they could find. Their brains were primitive compared to what would come later, but they were alive when so many others weren't. And in the post-apocalyptic world that emerged after the dust settled, being alive was everything. The early Paleocene epoch, those first few million years after the extinction, was a world unlike anything we can easily imagine. The climate was warm and humid, but the landscapes were eerily empty. Vast forests stretched across continents, but they were forests without the thunderous footfalls of giant herbivores. Rivers flowed untroubled by massive predators. The skies, once dominated by pterosaurs with wingspans wider than small airplanes, belonged now to birds and insects. It was in this empty world that the mammal takeover began. Not with a roar, but with a whisper, a soft rustling in the undergrowth, as small survivors emerged from their hiding places and began to explore. The first thing they discovered was space. Ecological niches that had been occupied by dinosaurs for over 100 million years were suddenly vacant. There were no giant plant eaters to compete with for vegetation. No massive predators to hide from. The world had become, quite literally, a land of opportunity, and mammals, with their warm blood and adaptable natures, were perfectly positioned to seize that opportunity. Within just a few million years, something remarkable began to happen. The small generalized mammals of the late Cretaceous started to diversify at a pace that defies imagination. Some began to specialize in eating plants, developing larger guts and flatter teeth for grinding vegetation. Others became carnivores, growing sharper teeth and more powerful jaws for hunting prey. But the most dramatic changes were happening in size. Freed from the constraints of a world dominated by giant reptiles, mammals began to grow, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily and inexorably. Paleocene mammals like Arctocean reached the size of small bears. Others, like the early ungulates that would eventually give rise to horses and cows, began experimenting with different body plans and feeding strategies. In the trees, early primates were developing grasping hands and forward-facing eyes. In the water, some mammals were taking their first tentative steps toward an aquatic lifestyle. This wasn't random evolution. This was adaptive radiation at its most spectacular. When a group of organisms suddenly finds itself in an environment with abundant resources and few competitors, evolution accelerates. Species split and diversify and experiment with new ways of living. What had taken tens of millions of years during the age of dinosaurs was now happening in just a few million. But perhaps the most important changes weren't visible in the fossil record at all. They were happening inside mammalian skulls. Brain size began to increase, not dramatically at first, but consistently. The ratio of brain to body weight that would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of mammals was beginning to emerge. With larger brains came more complex behaviours, better memory, improved problem-solving abilities. Some mammals began to show signs of social organisation. Others developed more sophisticated hunting strategies. A few even began to use simple tools, manipulating their environment in ways that earlier mammals never could. These cognitive advances weren't accidents. In a world where the old rules no longer applied, intelligence became a survival advantage. The mammals that could learn faster, adapt quicker, and solve problems more effectively were the ones that thrived. And as they thrived, they began to reshape the world around them. The forests of the early Paleocene were different from anything we see today. Without large herbivorous dinosaurs to browse the vegetation, plant communities evolved in new directions. Trees grew taller and denser. Understory vegetation became more complex. New types of fruits and seeds evolved, often in direct response to the feeding habits of the mammals that dispersed them. This was coevolution in action. As mammals diversified, they created new selective pressures on plants. As plants evolved new strategies for reproduction and defense, they created new opportunities for mammalian specialization. The web of life was rewiring itself from the ground up. But the most dramatic transformations were still to come. Because while the early Paleocene mammals were impressive in their diversity and adaptability, they were still relatively small. The largest predators were no bigger than wolves. The largest herbivores were roughly the size of sheep. The giants that would define the age of mammals were still evolving in the genetic shadows, waiting for their moment to emerge and claim their place in this reborn world. That emergence would come sooner than anyone might have expected, and when it did, it would be nothing short of spectacular. The stage was set. The ecological vacuum left by the dinosaurs was beginning to fill, and in burrows and nests across the globe, the ancestors of elephants and whales, of tigers and primates were taking their first small steps toward dominion. The mammal takeover had begun. But this was only the opening act of a drama that would play out over tens of millions of years, transforming not just life on Earth, but the very nature of what it meant to be alive. What happened next would make the initial survival look simple by comparison, because surviving extinction is one thing. Building a new world from the ashes of the old is something else entirely. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Evolution never does. But in geological terms, what unfolded over the next 10 million years was breathtakingly rapid. If you could fast forward through time, watching the Paleocene world reshape itself, you'd witness something that looks almost like magic. Small, cautious mammals gradually becoming bolder, larger, more diverse, empty landscapes filling with new forms of life, a planet learning how to be alive again. But to understand just how revolutionary this transformation was, we need to zoom in. We need to follow specific lineages as they stumbled, experimented, and occasionally struck evolutionary gold in their journey from survival to dominance. Take the story of Purgatorius, a tiny mammal no bigger than a mouse that lived in the forests of what is now Montana. Purgatorius had grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and a brain slightly larger than you'd expect for its body size. These might seem like minor details, but they represent the first tentative steps towards something extraordinary. This little creature, scurrying through Paleocene trees in search of insects and fruit, was one of our earliest primate ancestors. While Purgatorius was perfecting life in the canopy, other mammals were exploring entirely different possibilities. In the same forests, Arctochion was pushing the boundaries of mammalian size. Weighing perhaps 60 pounds, this bear-like omnivore was among the first mammals to seriously challenge the size limits that had constrained them during the age of dinosaurs. But here's what makes Arctochion fascinating. It wasn't just big, it was smart. Its skull shows evidence of a relatively large brain, and its teeth suggest a remarkably flexible diet. This was a mammal that could adapt its feeding strategy based on seasonal availability, switching between fruits, small animals, and even carrion when necessary. This adaptability would prove crucial, because the early Paleocene world was still unstable, still finding its equilibrium. Climates could shift dramatically within just a few thousand years. Food sources could appear and disappear with startling regularity. The mammals that survived and thrived were those that could roll with these changes, that could reinvent themselves when circumstances demanded it. Meanwhile, in the shallow seas and coastal wetlands, another revolution was quietly beginning. Some mammals were discovering that the boundary between land and water wasn't as fixed as it seemed. Early relatives of whales, creatures that still looked more like wolves than marine mammals, were spending increasing amounts of time in aquatic environments. These proto-whales weren't trying to become ocean giants, they were simply following the food. Coastal waters teemed with fish and marine invertebrates, resources that were largely untapped by other mammals. What started as occasional wading became regular swimming. Dense bones evolved to help with diving. Nostrils began their slow migration toward the top of the head. The whale's story is particularly striking because it illustrates just how flexible mammalian body plans could be. Within just a few million years, descendants of land-dwelling carnivores were developing flippers, echolocation, and the ability to hold their breath for extended periods. Evolution was operating with a freedom that had been impossible during the rigid hierarchies of the dinosaur age. But perhaps the most dramatic transformations were happening on land, where mammals were beginning to experiment with truly gigantic body sizes. The breakthrough came around 58 million years ago with the emergence of creatures like Coryphodon. Coryphodon was a revelation. Weighing over half a ton, this massive herbivore was larger than any mammal that had ever existed. Its skull alone was nearly 3 feet long, equipped with enlarged canine teeth that it likely used for display and combat. This wasn't just a big mammal. This was a mammal that was thinking big, acting big, claiming space in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few million years earlier. What made Coryphodon's success possible wasn't just the absence of dinosaurian competition. It was the evolution of more efficient digestive systems. As mammals grew larger, they needed to process enormous quantities of plant material to fuel their metabolisms. This led to the development of complex multi-chambered stomachs and specialized gut bacteria that could break down tough cellulose. These digestive innovations didn't just enable larger body sizes, they opened up entirely new ecological niches. Mammals could now exploit low-quality plant foods that had been largely ignored by earlier herbivores. They could survive in environments where high-energy foods were scarce. They could, quite literally, make a living from resources that had previously been worthless. The carnivores, of course, weren't about to be left behind. As herbivorous mammals grew larger and more numerous, they created opportunities for predators willing to hunt them. Enter Andrewsarchus, a wolf-like creature that may have reached lengths of over 12 feet and weights approaching 1,000 pounds. Andrewsarchus wasn't just a scaled-up version of earlier mammalian predators. Its skull shows adaptations for crushing bone, suggesting it could process carcasses more thoroughly than any previous mammal. Its limb bones indicate it was built for endurance rather than speed, perhaps capable of running down prey over long distances. This shift toward persistence hunting represents a crucial development in mammalian evolution. Unlike the ambush tactics favored by most dinosaurian predators, mammals were developing hunting strategies that relied on intelligence, coordination, and sheer determination. They were learning to outthink their prey rather than simply overpowering it. The cognitive demands of this new style of predation drove further increases in brain size. Mammals needed better spatial memory to track prey over long distances. They needed more sophisticated social coordination to hunt in groups. They needed the ability to plan ahead, to anticipate their prey's movements and reactions. These mental abilities, once developed for hunting, could be applied to other challenges. Problem-solving skills that evolved for catching prey could also be used for finding new food sources, avoiding predators, or navigating complex social relationships. Intelligence, once it emerged, became a Swiss Army knife of evolutionary advantages. But the most profound changes weren't happening to individual species. They were happening to entire ecosystems. The Mammal Takeover was creating new types of biological communities, new patterns of interaction between species, new ways for life to organize itself. In the forests, complex relationships were evolving between mammals and flowering plants. Many trees were developing fruits specifically designed to attract mammalian dispersers. The mammals, in turn, were evolving longer guts and more sophisticated digestive chemistry to process these new food sources. This wasn't just coevolution, it was the birth of modern forest ecology. In open habitats, grazing mammals were creating feedback loops with grassland plants. Their feeding patterns influenced which species dominated particular areas. Their hoofprints created microsites where certain seeds could germinate. Their dung provided fertilizer that shaped soil chemistry for generations. These ecosystem engineering effects meant that mammals weren't just adapting to their environments, they were actively creating new environments, new selective pressures, new opportunities for further diversification. The mammal takeover was becoming a runaway process, each innovation enabling further innovations in an ever-accelerating spiral of evolutionary creativity. Yet even as mammals were reshaping terrestrial ecosystems, they were also beginning to explore entirely new frontiers. Some lineages were perfecting flight, developing the powered flight capabilities that would eventually produce bats. Others were becoming fully aquatic, giving rise to early sirenians and cetaceans. Most remarkably, some mammals were developing the cognitive sophistication that would eventually lead to tool use, language, and culture. The primates swinging through Paleocene forests carried within their DNA the potential for everything from art to space exploration. None of this was predetermined. Evolution doesn't follow scripts or aim towards specific goals, but the mammal takeover created conditions where complexity could flourish, where experimentation was rewarded, where life could explore possibilities that had been closed off for over 100 million years. As the Paleocene epoch drew to a close, roughly 56 million years ago, the world had been utterly transformed. Where once dinosaurs had cast their shadows, mammals now claimed every ecological niche. The age of giants had given way to an age of innovation, adaptability, and explosive creativity. But this was still just the beginning. The mammals of the late Paleocene, impressive as they were, would soon face new challenges and new opportunities that would push evolution into even more extraordinary directions. The stage was set for the next act of the mammal revolution, and what was coming would make everything that had happened so far look like a rehearsal. The dawn of the Eocene epoch, 56 million years ago, arrived not with a whisper, but with a geological scream. The planet itself seemed to exhale, releasing vast quantities of carbon into the atmosphere in what scientists now call the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Temperatures soared. Ice caps that had existed for millions of years simply melted away. Sea levels rose dramatically. And in this hothouse world, mammalian evolution didn't just continue, it exploded. Picture the Earth during this time as a vast greenhouse, lush and steaming from pole to pole. Crocodiles basked in the waters of what is now the Arctic Ocean. Palm trees swayed in Antarctic breezes. And across this tropical paradise, mammals were about to embark on their most ambitious experiments yet. The warming climate didn't just provide new habitats, it created entirely new rules for how life could operate. With abundant rainfall and year-round growing seasons, plant productivity reached levels that dwarfed anything we see today. This botanical abundance provided the energy foundation for mammalian gigantism on a scale that would have seemed impossible just a few million years earlier. Enter the world of Wintertherium, a creature so bizarre it seems almost fictional. Standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder and stretching nearly 14 feet from nose to tail, this massive herbivore sported 6 bony protuberances on its skull and saber-like canine teeth that could extend over 7 inches. Wintertherium wasn't just big. It was architecturally impossible by earlier mammalian standards, a living cathedral of bone and muscle that announced mammals had truly inherited the earth. But size wasn't the only direction evolution was exploring. In the dense forests of Eocene North America and Europe, something even more remarkable was happening. Mammals were learning to fly. The earliest bats appear in the fossil record around 52 million years ago, and they arrived not as primitive gliders but as fully formed aerial acrobats. Creatures like Icaronicteris possessed sophisticated echolocation systems, flexible wing membranes, and the neural architecture necessary for three-dimensional navigation in complete darkness. They had solved the engineering challenges of powered flight so thoroughly that their basic body plan remains virtually unchanged today. This wasn't gradual evolution. This was innovation at light speed. Somewhere in the mammalian family tree, a lineage had made the leap from scurrying through trees to owning the night sky. They had claimed an ecological niche that no mammal had ever occupied, exploiting the vast populations of nocturnal insects that had proliferated in the warm, humid Eocene world. But perhaps the most profound changes were happening in the oceans, where mammals were writing an entirely new chapter in the book of marine life. The early whales of the Eocene, creatures like Basilosaurus, stretched over 60 feet in length and possessed skulls nearly 6 feet long. These weren't the streamlined ocean giants we know today. They were serpentine sea monsters, retaining tiny hind limbs that spoke of their terrestrial origins, while developing the massive jaws and specialized teeth of apex marine predators. Basilosaurus and its relatives were rewriting the rules of ocean ecology. For over 60 million years since the great marine reptiles had vanished, the seas had lacked truly gigantic predators. Now mammals were filling that void, but they were doing it in their own distinctly mammalian way. They maintained their warm-blooded metabolism, their complex social behaviors, their sophisticated intelligence. They were bringing terrestrial innovations to marine environments. Meanwhile, back on land, the relationship between mammals and their environment was becoming increasingly complex. The Eocene forests weren't just providing habitat for mammals, they were being actively shaped by mammalian behavior in ways that created feedback loops of extraordinary sophistication. Consider the story of early horses, creatures like Eohippus that stood barely 14 inches tall and possessed 4 toes on their front feet and 3 on their back. These forest-dwelling browsers weren't the thundering plains runners we might imagine. They were delicate, almost deer-like creatures, perfectly adapted for navigating dense woodland undergrowth. But here's what makes their story fascinating. They were unknowingly preparing for a world that didn't yet exist. Their small size, their multi-toed feet, their browsing habits were evolutionary investments in a future that would demand entirely different solutions. Evolution doesn't plan ahead, but it preserves variations that might prove useful when circumstances change. And circumstances were about to change dramatically. The cognitive revolution happening inside mammalian skulls was accelerating. Brain sizes were increasing not just in absolute terms, but relative to body size. The encephalization quotient, the ratio of brain weight to body weight, was climbing steadily across multiple mammalian lineages. This wasn't just about getting smarter, it was about developing entirely new ways of being alive. Early primates like Darwinius, preserved in exquisite detail in the Messel pit deposits of Germany, show evidence of forward-facing eyes, grasping hands, and brain structures associated with complex visual processing. These creatures were developing the neurological architecture that would eventually enable tool use, language, and abstract thought. They were becoming, in the most literal sense, the ancestors of consciousness as we know it. But intelligence wasn't the only cognitive innovation. Social complexity was exploding across mammalian lineages. Pack hunting behaviors were becoming more sophisticated. Mating systems were growing more elaborate. Communication methods were diversifying beyond simple calls and scents to include complex body language and even primitive forms of cultural transmission. This social complexity created new selective pressures. Mammals that could navigate intricate social hierarchies, form strategic alliances, and pass knowledge to their offspring had significant advantages over those that couldn't. The result was an arms race of social intelligence that would eventually produce everything from elephant matriarchies to primate politics. The Eocene world was also witnessing the emergence of true ecosystem engineers. Beavers, or their early relatives, were beginning to modify waterways on a landscape scale. Their dam-building activities created wetland habitats that supported entirely different communities of plants and animals. They weren't just adapting to their environment, they were redesigning it. This engineering impulse wasn't limited to beavers. Many mammalian lineages were developing behaviours that modified their surroundings in ways that benefited their species. Some were creating burrow systems that altered soil chemistry. Others were establishing trails that influenced plant distribution. A few were even engaging in primitive forms of agriculture, encouraging the growth of preferred food plants through selective harvesting and seed dispersal. These ecosystem modifications created opportunities for other species, which in turn created new selective pressures, which drove further evolutionary innovation. The mammal takeover wasn't just filling empty niches. It was creating new niches, new possibilities, new ways for life to organize itself. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Eocene mammalian evolution was its sheer creativity. Lineages were experimenting with body plans and lifestyles that seem almost whimsical in their diversity. There were mammals with retractable claws, mammals with prehensile noses, mammals with teeth specialized for cracking nuts, straining plankton, or slicing through tough plant fibers. Some mammals were developing elaborate display structures, bony crests and horns and antlers that served no obvious survival function, but played crucial roles in social signaling and mate selection. Others were evolving complex color patterns, sophisticated scent marking systems, and elaborate courtship behaviors that transformed mating from a simple biological function into an art form. This explosion of form and function wasn't random. It was the product of a world where experimentation was not only possible, but rewarded. The ecological vacuum left by the dinosaurs had created a laboratory for evolutionary innovation, and mammals were taking full advantage of every opportunity. Yet even as mammals were diversifying at an unprecedented rate, they were also beginning to face new challenges. The very success of the mammalian radiation was creating competition between mammalian lineages. Resources that had seemed limitless were becoming contested. Territories that had been freely available were now defended. The age of easy expansion was drawing to a close. What would replace it would be an age of refinement, specialization, and increasingly sophisticated adaptations to specific ecological niches. The mammals that would dominate the later Cenozoic would be those that could not just survive and reproduce, but compete effectively with other mammals. The stage was set for the next phase of the mammalian revolution. And what was coming would test every innovation, every adaptation, every evolutionary experiment that had emerged from the ashes of the Cretaceous extinction. The golden age of mammalian experimentation was about to give way to something harder, more competitive, and ultimately more recognizable as the world we know today. The cooling began so gradually that no single generation of mammals would have noticed, but over hundreds of thousands of years, the hothouse world of the early Eocene was slowly surrendering to something cooler, drier, more demanding. The vast tropical forests that had stretched from pole to pole began to fragment. Grasslands appeared where dense woodlands had once thrived. And in this changing world, the rules of mammalian success were about to be rewritten entirely. This wasn't a catastrophe like the asteroid impact that had ended the dinosaurs. This was something subtler and perhaps more profound: the gradual emergence of modern climate patterns. The Antarctic ice sheet was beginning to form. Ocean currents were reorganizing themselves. The atmospheric greenhouse that had nurtured mammalian gigantism for millions of years was slowly dissipating. And mammals, those master adapters, were about to prove their evolutionary genius once again. The first casualties of this climatic shift were the giants, creatures like Uintatherium, those cathedral-sized herbivores that had seemed so perfectly adapted to the Eocene world, found themselves increasingly out of place. Their massive bodies, once an advantage in a world of abundant vegetation, became liabilities in landscapes where food was more scattered and seasonal. But even as some lineages were struggling, others were discovering that the changing world offered unprecedented opportunities. The expansion of grasslands created vast new ecological theatres where entirely different evolutionary dramas could unfold. Enter the story of Mesohippus, a descendant of those tiny forest horses we met earlier. Still small, still multi-toed, but something fundamental was shifting in their anatomy. Their legs were getting longer, their teeth were becoming more complex, better suited for processing the tough grasses that were spreading across the landscape. Most tellingly, their middle toe was enlarging while their side toes were shrinking. This wasn't just anatomical change. This was evolutionary prophecy. These horses were unknowingly preparing for a world of open plains, where speed would matter more than agility, where endurance would trump stealth, where the ability to process low-quality plant material would determine survival. The grasslands weren't just creating new opportunities for herbivores, they were setting the stage for predator-prey relationships of breathtaking complexity. As grazing mammals ventured into open spaces, they became visible to predators from greater distances, but they also gained the ability to see those predators coming. This led to evolutionary arms races that would define mammalian life for the next 30 million years. Prey animals developed better eyesight, faster running speeds, more sophisticated herd behaviours. Predators responded with improved hunting strategies, better camouflage, more efficient killing techniques. The result was a continuous escalation of evolutionary innovation that pushed both hunters and hunted to new peaks of specialization. But perhaps the most remarkable development was happening in the mammalian brain. The cognitive demands of life in open environments were enormous. Herbivores needed to remember the locations of water sources, track seasonal changes in plant quality, and coordinate complex group movements. Predators needed to develop hunting strategies that could succeed against increasingly alert and mobile prey. The solution was intelligence, not just bigger brains, but better organized brains. Neural structures associated with spatial memory, social cognition, and long-term planning began to expand dramatically. Mammals were developing the cognitive architecture that would eventually enable everything from migration across continental distances to the formation of complex, multi-generational societies. Consider the emerging carnivore lineages of this period. Early cats were perfecting the art of solitary hunting, developing retractable claws, specialized killing teeth, and the neural circuitry necessary for split-second timing in ambush attacks. Early dogs were experimenting with pack hunting strategies that required unprecedented levels of social coordination and communication. These weren't just different hunting styles, they were different ways of being intelligent, different solutions to the challenge of making a living as a predator in an increasingly competitive world. The mammalian mind was diversifying just as dramatically as the mammalian body. Meanwhile, in the trees, primates were facing their own evolutionary crossroads. The fragmentation of forest habitats was forcing some lineages to spend more time on the ground, while others were becoming increasingly specialized for life in the canopy. Both strategies would prove successful, but they would lead to radically different evolutionary destinies. The ground-dwelling primates were developing longer limbs, more terrestrial locomotion patterns, and the beginnings of the social structures that would eventually characterize baboons and macaques. The arboreal specialists were perfecting three-dimensional movement through forest canopies, developing the grasping abilities and visual acuity that would define the great apes. But hidden within these diverging lineages were the genetic seeds of something extraordinary. Some primates were beginning to show signs of truly advanced cognitive abilities, problem-solving skills that went beyond simple trial and error, social behaviors that involved planning and deception, tool use that suggested an understanding of cause and effect. These cognitive innovations weren't accidents. They were responses to the increasing complexity of mammalian social life. As mammals became more intelligent, their societies became more sophisticated. As their societies became more sophisticated, the cognitive demands of navigating them increased. It was a feedback loop that would eventually produce levels of intelligence unknown anywhere else in the animal kingdom. The oceans, too, were witnessing revolutionary changes. The early whales were shedding their serpentine body plans in favour of the streamlined forms we recognise today. Creatures like Dorudon were developing the echolocation systems that would allow them to navigate and hunt in the three-dimensional world of the open ocean. But the most profound changes were happening in whale social behaviour. These marine mammals were developing communication systems of stunning complexity. Their songs could travel across entire ocean basins. Their social structures involved multi-generational relationships that persisted for decades. They were creating underwater cultures that would eventually rival anything found on land. The cooling climate was also driving innovation in unexpected directions. Some mammalian lineages were developing the ability to enter extended periods of dormancy, essentially shutting down their metabolisms during harsh seasons. Others were evolving thick fur coats and specialized circulatory systems that allowed them to remain active even in sub-freezing temperatures. These physiological adaptations opened up entirely new ecological niches. Mammals could now colonize environments that had been off-limits during the hothouse conditions of the early Eocene. They were spreading into high latitudes, high altitudes, and seasonal environments that required sophisticated behavioral and physiological responses to environmental change. The diversification wasn't just happening between different mammalian orders. Within individual lineages, specialization was reaching extraordinary levels. Early elephants were experimenting with different trunk configurations and tusk arrangements. Early carnivores were developing teeth specialized for bone crushing, fish catching, or insect eating. Early ungulates were evolving hooves, horns, and digestive systems adapted for every conceivable plant-eating lifestyle. This specialization came with trade-offs. As mammals became more perfectly adapted to specific niches, they became less able to survive outside those niches. The generalist mammals that had survived the Cretaceous extinction were giving way to specialists that could outcompete generalists in their chosen environments, but were vulnerable to environmental change. Yet even as specialization was increasing, some mammalian lineages were maintaining remarkable flexibility. Bears were developing the ability to switch between carnivorous and herbivorous diets, depending on seasonal availability. Pigs were retaining omnivorous feeding strategies that allowed them to exploit virtually any food source. Primates were maintaining the behavioral flexibility that would eventually enable them to colonize nearly every terrestrial environment on Earth. The late Eocene world was becoming recognizably modern in many ways. The major mammalian orders had established themselves. The basic ecological relationships between predators and prey, herbivores and plants, had stabilized into patterns that would persist for tens of millions of years. The age of wild experimentation was giving way to an age of refinement and optimization. But beneath this apparent stability, profound changes were still unfolding. The cooling climate was setting the stage for even more dramatic transformations. Ice ages were beginning to punctuate Earth's history with increasing frequency. Sea levels were dropping, continental configurations were shifting toward their modern arrangements. And in this changing world, mammals were about to face their greatest test yet. Not extinction this time, but something equally challenging: the need to adapt to rapidly changing environments while competing with other mammals that were just as intelligent, just as adaptable, and just as determined to survive. The mammal takeover had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. But success, as any evolutionary biologist will tell you, creates its own problems. The world was full of mammals now, and they were running out of empty niches to fill. What happened next would determine which lineages would dominate the modern world, and which would fade into evolutionary footnotes. The age of easy expansion was ending. The age of competition was about to begin. And in that competition, intelligence, adaptability, and sheer evolutionary creativity would matter more than ever before. The mammals that had inherited the Earth were about to discover just how difficult it could be to keep it. The real test came 34 million years ago, when the world crossed a threshold it had never encountered before. The planet didn't just cool, it froze. For the first time since the dinosaurs had ruled the Earth, permanent ice sheets began to form at the poles. The Antarctic ice cap locked away vast quantities of water, dropping sea levels by hundreds of feet. Ocean currents reorganized themselves into patterns that would persist for millions of years. And suddenly, the mammals that had thrived in the endless summer of the Eocene found themselves in a world where winter was no longer just a season. It was a way of life. This wasn't gradual climate change. This was the Eocene-Oligocene extinction event, and it hit mammalian diversity like a sledgehammer. Across Europe and Asia, entire families of mammals simply vanished from the fossil record. The giants that had defined the Eocene world, those cathedral-sized herbivores, those serpentine whales, those experimental carnivores with impossible teeth, found themselves on the wrong side of evolutionary history. But here's where the mammal story takes another extraordinary turn, because while some lineages were collapsing under the pressure of environmental change, others were using that same pressure as a launching pad for innovations that would reshape life on Earth. Take the story of grass itself. As the world cooled and dried, vast expanses of forest gave way to something entirely new, open grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon. These weren't just different plants, they were a different way of organizing an ecosystem. Grasses could survive droughts that killed trees. They could regrow from their roots after fires. They could carpet the landscape in ways that created opportunities for entirely new forms of life. And mammals were about to seize those opportunities with breathtaking creativity. The horses were among the first to crack the code of grassland living. Mesohippus gave way to Myohippus, which gave way to Parahippus, each generation slightly larger, slightly faster, with teeth slightly better adapted for processing tough prairie grasses. But the real breakthrough came with Merychippus, a horse that stood nearly 3 feet tall and possessed something revolutionary: high-crowned teeth that could grow continuously throughout its lifetime. This dental innovation wasn't just about eating grass. It was about living in a world where your food was trying to wear your teeth down to nothing. Grasses incorporate silica into their structure, making them abrasive enough to grind away tooth enamel like sandpaper. But Merychippus had solved this problem through sheer evolutionary audacity. Its teeth could regrow faster than grass could destroy them. More importantly, Merychippus was developing the single toe that would define modern horses. Those multiple toes that had served its ancestors so well in forest environments were becoming liabilities on hard grassland surfaces. Natural selection was sculpting a running machine, a creature built for speed and endurance across open terrain. But horses weren't the only mammals learning to read the grammar of grassland life. The first true elephants were emerging from their forest origins, developing the trunk flexibility and social coordination that would allow them to exploit scattered food resources across vast landscapes. Early camels were experimenting with the physiological innovations that would eventually let them survive in some of Earth's harshest environments. And in the expanding grasslands of Africa, something even more remarkable was happening. The ancestors of antelopes, gazelles, and buffalo were discovering that life in the open didn't have to mean life alone. They were developing herd behaviors of stunning sophistication, creating moving cities of animals that could detect predators from miles away and coordinate defensive strategies across thousands of individuals. These weren't just bigger flocks. These were complex social systems with hierarchies, communication networks, and collective decision-making processes that rivaled anything found in human societies. A wildebeest migration wasn't random wandering. It was a coordinated response to seasonal changes executed by animals with detailed mental maps of continental-scale landscapes. The predators, of course, weren't standing still. The cooling climate was driving carnivore evolution toward new peaks of efficiency and specialization. The first true cats were perfecting their killing techniques, developing the explosive power and precision timing that would make them the most successful solitary hunters in mammalian history. But it was the dogs that were writing the most revolutionary chapter in predator evolution. Pack hunting wasn't new, but the level of coordination being developed by early canids was unprecedented. They were learning to hunt in relay teams, with different individuals playing specialized roles in complex strategies that could unfold over hours or even days. This wasn't just about catching dinner. It was about developing forms of intelligence that had never existed before. Pack hunting required theory of mind, the ability to understand that other individuals have thoughts, intentions, and knowledge different from your own. It required communication systems sophisticated enough to coordinate actions across time and space. It required the kind of social intelligence that would eventually produce everything from military tactics to symphonic orchestras. Meanwhile, in the fragmenting forests, primates were facing an evolutionary crossroads that would determine the future of consciousness itself. Some lineages were doubling down on arboreal specialization, developing the incredible acrobatic abilities that would define gibbons and spider monkeys. Others were spending increasing amounts of time on the ground, developing the terrestrial adaptations that would eventually lead to baboons and macaques. But hidden within these diverging evolutionary paths was a third option, one that would prove far more revolutionary than anyone could have imagined. Some primates were maintaining their flexibility, refusing to commit fully to either arboreal or terrestrial lifestyles. They were keeping their options open, maintaining the behavioral and anatomical plasticity that would eventually enable them to colonize virtually every environment on Earth. These weren't the biggest primates, or the strongest, or the most specialized, but they possessed something that would prove more valuable than any physical adaptation: the ability to learn, to innovate, to pass knowledge from one generation to the next through something other than genetic inheritance. The early signs were subtle, tool use that went beyond simple trial and error, problem-solving behaviors that involved planning several steps ahead, social interactions that showed evidence of empathy, deception, and abstract reasoning. These primates weren't just getting smarter, they were developing the cognitive foundations for culture itself. But perhaps the most profound changes were happening in environments that most mammals had barely explored. The oceans were witnessing a revolution that would produce some of the largest and most intelligent creatures ever to live on Earth. The whales of the Oligocene were shedding the last vestiges of their terrestrial origins. Creatures like Janjutatus were developing the massive heads and specialized feeding apparatus that would define modern baleen whales. Others, like early sperm whales, were perfecting the deep-diving abilities that would allow them to hunt in the abyssal depths of the ocean. These weren't just anatomical changes, they were cognitive revolutions. Deep-diving whales were developing three-dimensional spatial memory systems that could navigate the featureless depths of the open ocean. Baleen whales were learning to coordinate feeding behaviors across entire populations, creating some of the most spectacular wildlife displays on Earth. And their communication systems were becoming something unprecedented in the natural world. Whale songs could travel across entire ocean basins, carrying information about feeding areas, breeding grounds, and social relationships across distances that dwarfed any terrestrial communication network. The cooling world was also creating opportunities in unexpected places. As ice sheets expanded and sea levels dropped, land bridges appeared between continents that had been separated for millions of years. This created corridors for mammalian migration on a scale that had been impossible since the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. The Great American Biotic Interchange was still millions of years in the future, But smaller-scale exchanges were already beginning. Mammals were island-hopping across temporary land bridges, carrying their genes and their innovations to new continents. Each successful colonization was an evolutionary experiment, a test of how well mammalian adaptations could translate to new environments. Some of these experiments failed spectacularly. Lineages that had thrived in their home continents found themselves unable to compete with native species that had evolved different solutions to similar problems. But others succeeded beyond all expectations, establishing themselves so thoroughly in their new homes that their origins were forgotten. This intercontinental mixing wasn't just about geography. It was about evolutionary innovation spreading across the globe, creating new combinations of traits, new possibilities for adaptation, new experiments in how to be a mammal. The Oligocene world was becoming something unprecedented in Earth's history. A planet where intelligence wasn't just an occasional evolutionary accident, but a consistent theme across multiple lineages. Mammals weren't just getting bigger or faster or stronger. They were getting smarter, more social, more capable of complex behaviours that would have been impossible for their Paleocene ancestors. And this intelligence was beginning to feed back on itself. Smart mammals were creating more complex environments, which created selective pressures for even greater intelligence, which led to even more complex behaviours. It was a runaway process that would eventually produce levels of cognitive sophistication that would have seemed like magic to the small survivors of the Cretaceous extinction. But even as mammalian intelligence was exploding across multiple lineages, the cooling climate was setting the stage for even greater challenges. The ice ages were coming, bringing with them environmental changes so rapid and dramatic that they would test every adaptation, every innovation, every evolutionary experiment that mammals had developed over the past 30 million years. The mammals that had inherited the Earth were about to discover that keeping it would require levels of adaptability, intelligence, and sheer evolutionary creativity that would push life itself into entirely new territories. The golden age of mammalian experimentation was ending. The age of mammalian mastery was about to begin, and what emerged from that mastery would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The stage was set for the final act of the mammalian revolution. And when that curtain rose, it would reveal creatures so intelligent, so adaptable, so fundamentally different from anything that had come before, that they would eventually develop the ability to understand their own evolutionary history. They would become us. The ice was coming, but it wouldn't arrive like the asteroid that had ended the dinosaurs. This would be slower, more patient, more inexorable. Over the next 20 million years, the planet would settle into a rhythm of freeze and thaw, expansion and contraction, challenge and adaptation that would test every innovation mammals had developed since that first desperate scramble from the ashes of extinction. The Miocene epoch arrived 15 million years ago, like a dress rehearsal for the modern world. Grasslands stretched across continents, in golden waves that seemed to breathe with the wind. Mountains thrust skyward as tectonic plates collided and separated. And in this restless landscape, mammals were writing the final chapters of their takeover story. But these weren't the tentative experiments of the early Paleocene anymore. These were creatures that had mastered the art of being alive. The horses of the Miocene weren't just running faster than their ancestors. They were thinking their way across landscapes, developing mental maps that could encompass hundreds of miles, coordinating herd movements that required split-second timing and absolute trust. Watch Hipparion thundering across the plains of ancient Nebraska, and you're watching more than just an animal in motion. You're watching the culmination of 50 million years of evolutionary refinement. Every stride perfectly calibrated for maximum efficiency. Every heartbeat synchronized with a respiratory system that could maintain oxygen flow during extended sprints. Every sense organ tuned to detect the subtlest signs of danger or opportunity. This wasn't just anatomy anymore, this was engineering. The carnivores had kept pace with every innovation. Amphition, the bear dog that stalked Miocene forests, stood 6 feet at the shoulder and possessed jaws that could crush the skull of any prey animal on the continent. But size wasn't its only weapon. Its brain showed the neural architecture of a creature capable of planning complex hunts, remembering the locations of kills across vast territories, and adapting its hunting strategies based on seasonal changes in prey behaviour. Meanwhile, the first true cats were perfecting killing techniques that would remain virtually unchanged for the next 15 million years. The saber-toothed cats weren't just displaying impressive dental hardware, they were demonstrating precision engineering, developing skull morphology and jaw mechanics that could deliver fatal wounds with surgical accuracy. But perhaps the most remarkable predators were the ones that had learned to hunt without killing at all. The early baleen whales had discovered something revolutionary. They could harvest the ocean's productivity directly, filtering vast quantities of tiny organisms through feeding apparatus that was part net, part vacuum cleaner, part biological miracle. Blue whales were approaching their modern size, becoming the largest animals ever to exist on Earth. But their size wasn't random gigantism. It was a carefully calibrated response to the physics of filter feeding. Larger mouths could process more water, larger bodies could store more energy for long migrations, larger brains could coordinate the complex behaviours necessary for efficient feeding in three-dimensional ocean environments. These weren't just big animals, they were floating ecosystems, supporting communities of parasites and symbionts while maintaining social relationships that spanned entire ocean basins. Their songs had become so sophisticated that different populations were developing distinct dialects, cultural variations that were passed from one generation to the next through vocal learning. On land, the elephant story was reaching similar heights of complexity. The proboscideans of the Miocene weren't just large herbivores, they were landscape architects, using their trunks and tusks to modify environments on a continental scale. Their feeding behaviours created clearings that supported different plant communities. Their wallowing activities created water sources that sustained other species during dry seasons. But most remarkably, they were developing the social intelligence that would eventually produce some of the most complex animal societies on Earth. Elephant matriarchies weren't just family groups. They were information networks, repositories of ecological knowledge that could span generations. An elderly matriarch could remember drought patterns from decades earlier, leading her family to water sources that younger elephants had never seen. This wasn't instinct, this was culture, knowledge systems that existed independently of genetic programming, passed from mind to mind through learning and imitation. The primates were exploring similar territories, but with a twist that would prove crucial for the future of intelligence itself. While elephants were developing culture within stable social groups, some primates were experimenting with cultural transmission between groups, sharing innovations across genetic boundaries in ways that had never happened before. Tool use was spreading through primate populations like wildfire. Not just the simple stick-dipping behaviours of early hominoids, but sophisticated technologies that required planning, preparation, and teaching. Some populations were developing regional variations in tool design, creating the first technological traditions in mammalian history. But the most profound changes were happening inside primate skulls. Brain sizes were increasing dramatically, but more importantly, brain organization was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The prefrontal cortex, that executive control center that would eventually enable abstract reasoning and long-term planning, was expanding at rates that defied normal evolutionary timescales. These primates weren't just getting smarter, they were developing entirely new forms of intelligence, cognitive abilities that had never existed in the history of life on Earth. They were beginning to understand causation, to imagine counterfactual scenarios, to conceive of themselves as agents capable of changing their environment through deliberate action. And then the Ice Ages began in earnest. 2.5 million years ago, the planet entered a phase of climatic instability that would make all previous environmental changes look gentle by comparison. Ice sheets advanced and retreated across continents with metronomic regularity. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet. Entire ecosystems appeared and disappeared within geological eye blinks. This wasn't just climate change. This was evolutionary boot camp, a relentless testing ground that would separate the truly adaptable from the merely successful. Many mammalian lineages couldn't keep up. The Miocene giants, those perfectly specialized products of 15 million years of evolutionary refinement, found themselves fatally committed to environmental conditions that no longer existed. The saber-toothed cats, despite their fearsome efficiency, couldn't adapt quickly enough to changing prey populations. The giant ground sloths, magnificent in their specialized niches, became evolutionary dead ends when those niches vanished, but other lineages thrived in the chaos. The species that survived weren't necessarily the biggest or the strongest or even the smartest. They were the most flexible, the most capable of reinventing themselves when circumstances demanded it. And leading this parade of evolutionary survivors was a lineage of African primates that had learned to walk upright, use tools systematically, and pass knowledge between generations through something unprecedented in the history of life: symbolic language. They called themselves humans, though they wouldn't develop that word for several million years, and they were about to do something that no species in the history of Earth had ever accomplished. They were about to take conscious control of their own evolution. The mammal takeover that had begun 66 million years ago, with tiny survivors scurrying through post-apocalyptic landscapes, was about to reach its ultimate expression. Not in size, not in strength, not even in intelligence alone, but in the ability to understand and manipulate the very forces that had shaped life since the beginning of time. These upright apes would eventually develop agriculture, domesticating other mammals and bending entire ecosystems to their will. They would develop medicine, extending lifespans and reducing infant mortality in ways that violated every rule of natural selection. They would develop technology, creating tools so sophisticated that they could reshape landscapes faster than geological processes. Most remarkably, they would develop science, gaining the ability to understand their own evolutionary history, to trace their lineage back through the fossil record to those first desperate survivors of the Cretaceous extinction. They would learn to read the story written in stone, to decode the genetic messages passed down through millions of generations, to understand that they were not separate from nature, but its most extraordinary product. The mammal revolution had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of those Paleocene survivors. From mouse-sized insectivores hiding in burrows, life had produced creatures capable of contemplating the universe itself, of understanding their place in the vast sweep of evolutionary time, of imagining futures that extended beyond their own individual lifespans. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this transformation is that it's still happening. Evolution didn't stop when humans developed consciousness. If anything, it accelerated. We are still changing, still adapting, still experimenting with new ways of being alive. The mammals inherited the Earth not through conquest but through adaptation, not through dominance but through diversity, not through strength but through the endless creativity of life itself. And that creativity continues today, in every birth, every innovation, every moment when life finds a new way to flourish in an ever-changing world. The asteroid that fell 66 million years ago wasn't the end of one story. It was the beginning of ours. And that story, the story of how life rebounds from catastrophe, how evolution turns endings into beginnings, how the meek truly can inherit the Earth, continues to unfold around us every single day. The mammal takeover isn't history, It's happening right now, in every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of consciousness that connects us to those first brave survivors who emerged from the darkness and chose to build a new world from the ashes of the old.